Well, thank you for allowing me to take some time off to go up north to land and celebrate our oldest son's birthday. I have watched the video of Matt Downing preaching last Sunday, and I thank him so much for filling in. He did a great job standing before you and preaching last week. Thank you, Matt. Yeah. All those who have left behind the old way of life, culture's way of life, and have chosen to turn to and trust and follow the Lord, those individuals have a self-identity that's totally different than everyone else. It's an identity that's different than the one they used to have. It's an identity that's different than that the rest of culture has. We've entitled this sermon series, as we're teaching through the book of 1 Peter, Self-Identify. Now, am I going in and out? Bring me something new, guys, while I'm talking. Okay. So Paul's writing this, Peter's writing this letter. We call it the book of 1 Peter. He's writing this letter to folks who have recently turned away from culture's way of life and are following Christ Jesus, and he's doing what he can to help them understand their new identity. And we've been standing along beside them, and we've been listening as he's been giving encouragement. It's been helpful to us too. This morning, we're going to look at one of those traits that has always been hard for followers to grasp. We're going to be looking at the trait of being persecuted. Nobody ever wants persecuted. But for those of us who've given our lives to the Lord as Christ followers, persecution is always going to follow us. If we're not experiencing some persecution as a church, if we're not experiencing some blowback as Christ followers, something's wrong. Something's wrong if we're not experiencing that. George MacLeod said this: "The greatest criticism of the church today is that no one wants to persecute it because there's nothing very much to persecute it about." Sadly, that's the case. Churches are not displaying a lot of difference from the culture around us. People are not displaying a lot of difference from the folks in the culture around us. Consequently, we're not getting much persecution. That wasn't the case with the folks to whom Peter was writing this letter. They were experiencing some persecution as Christ followers, and so Peter's wanting to kind of explain that to them. He's kind of wanting to put their hearts to rest regarding what they were receiving. Follow along with me here in 1 Peter chapter 4, beginning in verse 12. Peter writes this: "Dear friends, when the fiery ordeal arises among you to test you, don't be surprised by it as if something unusual were happening to you. Instead, as you share in the sufferings of the Messiah, rejoice, so that you may also rejoice with great joy at the revelation of his glory. If you are ridiculed for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. None of you, however, should suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler." That goes without saying. "But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he should not be ashamed, but should glorify God with that name. For the time has come for judgment to begin with God's household, and if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who disobey the gospel of God?" Then he quotes here from Proverbs chapter 11, verse 31. He says, "And if the righteous is saved with difficulty, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So, those who suffer according to God's will should, in doing good, entrust themselves to a faithful Creator." Okay, interesting topic that Peter's bringing up and sharing with them, and then directly sharing with us. Christ followers now, just like Christ followers then. Is that a handheld? That's not going to, okay. Thank you, Tony. Okay, persecution. Let's see what Peter has to say about persecution. Let's begin with this. Persecution engulfs us. It's all around us. It was with them and it is with us. I know this idea doesn't fit into the paradigm that's being painted today by so many very popular preachers. Preachers today are saying this. They're saying, my congregation is already exposed to enough difficulty in life. I'm not going to talk to them about anything that's difficult. I'm only going to talk to my congregation and those who are listening to me on television. I'm only going to talk to them about pleasant things. I'm only going to talk to them about pleasing things. I'm not going to talk to them about sin. I'm not going to talk to them about suffering. I'm not going to talk to them about persecution. I wish I could do that. But you know what my assignment is? My assignment is to preach the Bible. I can't just skip over it because it's difficult. If that's the kind of message you're always looking for when you come here, let me just tell you right now, and I hate to do this because I like big attendance, but if that's what you're looking for when you come here, that's not what you're always going to get. You're always going to get the Bible. You're not going to get what's pleasing every time you come because the Bible talks about encouragement. It also talks about discouragement. It talks about pleasant things. It talks about unpleasant things. And this morning, Peter has brought us to a passage where he's talking about some things that are a little bit painful to hear. So that's what we're going to give attention to this morning. Peter, by the way, and I wish I didn't have to tell you this. The very man who's written this letter, Peter, the very apostle we're studying this morning. I wish I didn't have to tell you that Peter was crucified on a cross upside down. That was not a very pleasant thing. He wouldn't stop talking about Jesus, so they executed him on a cross. I wish I didn't have to tell you that. I wish I didn't have to tell you that the other apostles, except for John, he was very young, the rest of the apostles were executed for being Christ followers. They wouldn't stop talking about Jesus. They were persecuted. I wish I didn't have to tell you that there were hundreds, perhaps even thousands of followers who were fed to the lions in the Roman Colosseum for being Christ followers. Isn't that terrible? I wish I didn't have to tell you that. I wish I didn't have to tell you about the many, many Christ followers being harshly persecuted all over the world today just for following Christ. They're being persecuted today. It's a sad, sad thing. I wish I could tell you that all of them are having the best life now, but they're not. They haven't read that book. They're being persecuted for being Christ followers all over the planet today. Listen to verse 12 again. Peter says, "Dear friends," talking to Christ followers, "when, not if, when the fiery ordeal arises among you to test you, don't be surprised by it as if something unusual were happening to you." What is Peter saying? He's saying this persecution is not unusual. It's normal. We are all going to be persecuted for following Christ. All of us. All of us who follow Christ. All of us who stand for Christ. All of us who speak out for Christ. We are all going to be persecuted for following Christ. That comes with the commitment. That comes with the commitment. What does change, I suppose, is not the normality of it. What does change is the intensity of the persecution. In fact, when it comes to persecution, our persecution is pretty light. Come across two men, Andrew Black and Greg Bird, who have listed the degrees of persecution of Christ followers, starting with the least that are being experienced today and increasing to the most severe that's being experienced today. Here's what we as Christ followers face. Here's where we are. Disapproval, ridicule, pressure to conform, maybe loss of opportunities. Those are the kinds of persecution we face. That's pretty light stuff. Some more extreme cases might include economic punishment, shunning, alienation from community, loss of employment, maybe loss of property. There are folks right here in our nation who are facing that kind of persecution. But other followers in other parts of the world are facing much more harsh persecution. Physical abuse, mob violence, harassment by officials, kidnapping, forced labor, imprisonment, physical torture, and even murder or execution. And we've all seen the video of that on our television. Peter's saying, as you've chosen to follow Christ, as you've chosen to trust Him and follow Christ, oh my goodness, He brings such joy to life. He brings such encouragement to life. He brings such strength to life. He brings direction to life. We become His sheep. He becomes our shepherd. He guides us, navigates through the issues of life in such a victorious way. But on that same plate, for those of us who trust and follow Christ, comes persecution. We can't take one and shun the other. We need to be prepared to embrace the persecution of being a Christ follower, as all of those who have gone before us and as most who live on the planet today outside of those of us who are very privileged here in the United States. Persecution engulfs us. Here's another thing. Persecution tests us. Did you notice that there in verse 12? Dear friends, when the fiery ordeal rises among you to test you. Now, we need to understand Peter is making a point here. Peter does not, he's not saying persecution does not test us to see if we pass or fail. Persecution does not test us to see if we pass or fail the test. Years ago, I had a pastor friend who had a son in high school who was a brilliant young man. He had photostatic memory, his father said. Therefore, he didn't have to study very hard in order to make A's on his tests. He was always in the gifted group, the talented group, always at the top of his class. And one day he had to leave early and said to me, Steve, I'm going because my wife and I have to meet with one of my son's teachers because of a failing grade he made on an American history test. And I was surprised. I said, I thought your son had photostatic memory. I thought he could pass almost anything they threw at him. And he said, well, it depends on the way the test is presented. He said, my son failed a test that only had one question on it. The question was, can you name the first 16 presidents of the United States? And my son answered the question, yes. Yes, I can name the first 16 presidents of the United States. He answered the question correctly. So John was having to go up to school and talk with the teacher. Come on. Call him in, let him name the 16 presidents for you. Pass or fail. This is not a pass or fail kind of a test we're looking at. We're not persecuted to see if we pass or fail a test. What Peter is saying is that persecution is a trial intended to make us stronger. You know, like difficult athletic training to prepare for a big game, or like farmers have to experience such difficulty and such trial in order to see a bumper crop. That's the kind of trial, the kind of test Peter's talking about. Persecution is a trial that makes Christ followers stronger. Thomas Tidwell records this amazing story. Let me read it to you. Tidwell writes, "My friend, Dr. Tad Stewart, took a church in Tehran, Iran. He and his family were there during revolution and revolt and riot. The government under the Ayatollah closed his small, struggling church. There were very few in number, but the government came in and burned all the Bibles and all the Sunday school curriculum. Then they took a big padlock and locked the door of the church. They wiped their hands and said, 'Aha, we have closed Christianity in Iran.' Then Stewart and his wife opened their small home on Sunday mornings for the people to come for worship. Nobody dared to say where they were going, and they came early in the morning while it was still dark. Persecution caused them to hide. But the church attendance grew until it doubled and then tripled. People smuggled in Bibles as if they were pure gold. Stewart said that when he opened the Bible and read it, you could have heard a pin drop. Suddenly, electricity and faith broke out in that church, and soon the church made its impact all over the city of Tehran, then all over the nation of Iran, and even that part of the Middle East." What Peter's saying is that's what persecution does for us. It pushes us. It tries us. It suppresses us. Persecution causes us to grow. It causes us to rebound. Persecution causes us as followers of Christ to respond like nothing else ever could and nothing else ever would. Peter's explaining to the Christ followers there to whom he's writing this letter, folks, don't be shocked if you're going through trial, because trial is going to make out of you some strong followers. The test of persecution is going to make out of you some strong churches. All over the globe today, in China, because Christianity is being suppressed, the underground church is growing like we've never seen it grow before. One of the problems we have here in the United States is we, up until now, have not been persecuted. Peter's saying, respond to persecution the way it's intended to be responded to. God is trying you and training you, and you're going to grow into strong individuals and strong churches. Let's look at one last thing. Persecution blesses us. Verse 13 and 14, Peter writes, "As you share in the sufferings of the Messiah, rejoice, so that you may also rejoice with great joy at the revelation of His glory. If you're ridiculed for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you." Verse 16, "If anyone suffers as a Christian, he should not be ashamed, but should glorify God with that name." Verse 19, "So those who suffer according to God's will should, in doing good, entrust themselves to a faithful Creator." And I can't imagine a more blessed situation than that which Peter's referring to here, to entrust ourselves into the hands of a faithful Creator, God Himself, because in the doing of it, God blesses us, and I'm afraid it's a blessing for which we're being robbed here in our cushy nation so far. You mind if I share another story with you? This whole concept of persecution is just one that lends itself so well to this. Let me share another story with you. John Lennox, Professor John Lennox from Oxford University, writes about his encounter with a Russian Christ follower who spent years in a Siberian labor camp for the crime of teaching his children out of the Bible. put in prison camp. Lennox writes this. He told me he had seen things that no man should ever have to see. I listened, thinking how little I really knew about life and wondering how I would have fared under the circumstances. As if he had read my thoughts, he suddenly said, "You couldn't cope with that, could you?" Embarrassed, I stumbled out something like, "No, I'm sure you're right." He then grinned and said, "Nor could I. I was a man who fainted at the sight of my own blood, let alone that of someone else." But what I discovered at the camp was this: God does not help us to face theoretical situations, but real ones. Like you, I could not imagine how I could cope in the gulag. That was the name of the prison. But once there, I found that God blessed me, exactly as Jesus had promised his disciples when he was preparing them for persecution. Lennox concludes with this: we can be confident then that the Lord will give us sufficient grace to handle whatever comes our way as soon as it comes our way, but not a moment before. So, this is the mystery. In the midst of persecution, God blesses us. It's a special kind of blessing. It's a blessing we can't receive any other way. It's a blessing we can't imagine. It's a blessing we try to put ourselves in the shoes of those who are experiencing the persecution, but we really can't. But if we ever face the day when we're being put in the shoes of those who are really, truly being persecuted, not just shunned, on that day, God is going to rain down blessings on us as individuals and blessings on us as a church. Being shunned today, that's unfortunate. Being ridiculed today for taking a stand for Christ, that's unfortunate. But that doesn't compare to those in the world today who are being bullied and ruined and persecuted and even executed because of their stand for Christ, because they are receiving a persecution that accompanies a great blessing from God, a blessing for which we should envy them. We should envy them. You know, we've got to ask ourselves the question, am I being persecuted? Are you being persecuted for being a Christ follower? These folks were. These folks were. Of course, we're not prepared for this. These folks weren't. You know, if you were in control of your life and your experiences, you would surely have avoided the experience of persecution altogether. You wouldn't experience any shunning. You wouldn't experience any ridiculing. You wouldn't experience any loss of promotion if you were in control. But you're not in control, are you? God's in control of our lives. God's in control of your life. God's the one who says whether we should be persecuted or not persecuted. That's a decision He makes, not us. If we're followers of Christ, if we speak out in defense of Christ, we're going to be persecuted. It's going to follow us. It's going to engulf us. But that persecution will not be unusual. That will not be considered unusual. It will not be considered odd. Peter's saying, that's normal. That's typical. Persecution for our stand in Christ comes with all the delight and all the benefits. Peter's saying to us today, let's embrace it. Let's take it. It's a badge of courage. It's the badge of belonging to Christ Jesus. If we're being persecuted for our stand for Christ Jesus, that is an attaboy. That is an attagirl. and He's going to bless us for it. You've been unusually quiet this morning, and I know why. Pray with me.